The golden-maned figure stands majestically atop Pride Rock, bathed in morning light as animals bow before him. This iconic image of Mufasa has defined leadership for an entire generation. But what if everything we thought we knew about this celebrated king was fundamentally wrong? Mufasa wasn't just flawed, he was a catastrophic political leader whose governance mistakes directly led to his kingdom's collapse. The sunlit savanna he proudly showed his son would transform into a barren graveyard within a single generation. Let's cut through the nostalgia and face an uncomfortable truth. Beneath the impressive mane and booming voice was a ruler who made three devastating political miscalculations that doomed the Pride Lands. These weren't minor missteps. They were fundamental governance failures that created perfect conditions for disaster. The Pride Lands collapse wasn't simply bad luck, or Scar's evil. It was the inevitable result of systemic vulnerabilities Mufasa himself created. Think about it. How does a thriving ecosystem transform into a wasteland so quickly unless the groundwork for failure was already laid? Most analyses of Mufasa focus on his personal virtues, his courage, wisdom, and compassion. But these qualities, while admirable, mask the uncomfortable reality of his reign. Political leadership requires more than good character. It demands strategic foresight, inclusive governance, and robust succession planning. Areas where Mufasa's performance was shockingly inadequate. Bold displays of personal strength don't compensate for catastrophic policy failures. The canonical evidence is hiding in plain sight. When we analyze key scenes through a governance lens rather than simply as family drama, a disturbing pattern emerges. Mufasa's leadership contained fatal contradictions between his stated principles and his actual governance practices. His circle of life philosophy, while poetic, failed to address the complex political realities of his kingdom. Consider the stark contrast. At the beginning of his son's story, the Pride Lands thrive with abundance. Clear streams, green savanna, and prosperous animal subjects. Yet, by the time Simba returns as an adult, those same lands lie in ruins, with crucial resources depleted and subjects scattered or suffering. How could such devastation occur so rapidly unless the kingdom's foundation was already critically compromised? Honestly, as much as we love Mufasa as a character, we've been avoiding a serious assessment of his actual governance record. His brief screen time focuses on his role as a father, but the background evidence of his leadership decisions tells a much more troubling story. The truth becomes clear when we stop viewing the narrative as simply a father-son tale and recognize it as a chronicle of political transition and governance failure. Mufasa's teachings to Simba are filled with philosophical platitudes rather than practical leadership instruction, a critical oversight for an heir's education. What if Mufasa's greatest failure wasn't his battle with Scar, but his fundamental misunderstanding of what sustainable leadership requires? Let's be methodical in our analysis. Three specific fatal mistakes stand out when we examine Mufasa's reign. First, dynastic negligence. Mufasa's catastrophic mishandling of the Scar situation went beyond family drama. It was a failure to address a clear political threat within his inner circle. Second, resource mismanagement. His approach to the hyena territories created unsustainable resource pressure that would later explode into ecological disaster. Third, heir unprepared. Mufasa left Simba woefully unprepared for governance challenges, focusing on philosophical concepts rather than practical leadership skills. Each of these failures created critical vulnerabilities that, when combined, guaranteed the Pride Lands' eventual collapse. The evidence isn't speculative, it's embedded throughout canon, waiting to be recognized. Let's face it, we've been so captivated by Mufasa's charisma and Scar's villainy that we've failed to see the structural governance issues that made the kingdom so fragile in the first place. Ruling through strength and tradition without addressing underlying political tensions is a recipe for disaster. When we re-examine Mufasa's most famous line, "Everything the light touches is our kingdom," we begin to see troubling implications. This statement reflects a simplistic, territory-based understanding of governance that ignores complex political realities. It's a king pointing to land rather than discussing the intricate social contracts that sustain a functioning society. The Pride Lands' political structure under Mufasa shows concerning authoritarian elements. Major decisions appear to flow from him alone, with little evidence of consultation with other species or even among the lion pride. This centralization of power created a dangerous single point of failure in the kingdom's governance. Compare this with the leadership style Simba eventually develops, which incorporates counsel from various sources and ultimately acknowledges the need for reconciliation with former enemies. These crucial political evolutions weren't built on Mufasa's example. They required Simba to transcend his father's governance model. What makes this analysis so compelling is how it transforms our understanding of the entire narrative. The Pride Land's devastation wasn't simply the result of Scar's malice. It was the inevitable outcome of governance vulnerabilities Mufasa failed to address. This changes everything. What if Mufasa's true legacy isn't as the ideal king, but as the ruler whose political blind spots ensured his kingdom's downfall? This isn't to diminish Mufasa as a character or father. His personal virtues remain admirable. But lionizing his leadership while ignoring his governance failures prevents us from understanding the true political lessons of the Pride Land saga. As we proceed with this analysis, prepare to reconsider everything you thought you knew about the Golden King of Pride Rock. The evidence reveals a much more complicated legacy, one where Mufasa's greatest strengths as a character often represented his most significant weaknesses as a ruler. The majestic figure standing on Pride Rock, commanding respect and admiration, also created the conditions for his kingdom's collapse. How could such a beloved leader make such catastrophic mistakes? And most importantly, could the Pride Land's darkest chapter have been prevented with better governance? The answers lie in a deeper examination of Mufasa's first fatal mistake, his fundamentally flawed approach to managing internal political threats. The truth about this failure will transform how you see the entire Pride Land saga. To understand the magnitude of Mufasa's governance failures, we must first establish the political structure of the Pride Lands under his rule. The kingdom operated as an absolute monarchy with Mufasa at its center, wielding unchallenged authority over both territory and subjects. This consolidation of power, while creating an appearance of stability, laid the groundwork for catastrophic vulnerability. Let's analyze what canon reveals about Pride Land's governance. Decision-making was centralized in Mufasa alone, with no evidence of councils, checks on royal power, or formalized roles for other species despite their inclusion in the circle of life philosophy. This disconnect between stated values and actual governance structure created dangerous contradictions. A kingdom's resilience depends not on its ruler's personal strength, but on its institutional foundations. Now we can examine Mufasa's first fatal mistake in proper context: dynastic negligence, his catastrophic mishandling of the Scar situation. This wasn't merely a family rift, it was a fundamental failure of political leadership that created conditions for disaster. Canon provides clear evidence of this governance failure. Scar's position as the king's brother gave him proximity to power without responsibility, the most dangerous political arrangement possible. Rather than either fully integrating Scar into governance with meaningful duties or addressing him as a political rival, Mufasa allowed this threat to fester within his inner circle. In governance terms, this represents a critical failure of internal threat management. Effective rulers throughout history have recognized that potential successors must either be meaningfully engaged in governance or neutralized as threats. There is no safe middle ground. Mufasa chose neither path, instead allowing an ambitious rival to remain in a position of privilege without purpose. Let's face it, Mufasa's approach to Scar wasn't just a family failure, it was a catastrophic political miscalculation. The evidence appears in their canonical interactions, which reveal not simply brotherly tension, but unresolved power dynamics that threatened kingdom stability. Political tensions left unaddressed don't disappear. They intensify until they explode. Consider their confrontation scene. Mufasa reprimands Scar for missing the presentation ceremony, but offers no consequences for this dereliction of royal family duty. This reveals a troubling pattern. Mufasa recognized the threat Scar represented, but addressed it through personal confrontation rather than systemic political reform. This governance approach, attempting to manage political threats through personal authority rather than institutional structures, created a kingdom entirely dependent on Mufasa's continued rule. The moment he was no longer present, the entire system became vulnerable to capture. What makes this failure so significant is that it contradicts Mufasa's own circle of life philosophy. If all creatures have their place in maintaining balance, why was there no formalized role for the king's brother? This inconsistency between stated values and political practice undermined the kingdom's stability. A ruler who preaches interconnection while practicing centralized authority creates dangerous contradictions. The Pride Land's power structure under Mufasa exhibited classic signs of an absolutist regime. Impressive stability while the strong ruler lives, followed by catastrophic collapse once that singular authority disappears. This represents a fundamental governance failure, not simply a personal tragedy. Examining Pride Land hierarchies more closely reveals the extent of this problem. Canon shows major decisions flowing exclusively from Mufasa, with his majordomo Zazu serving as informant rather than counsel. When other characters like Simba or Nala express concerns, they're given philosophical responses rather than meaningful political engagement. Honestly, this centralization of power is particularly evident in how Mufasa handles border regions. The elephant graveyard situation reveals not just a dangerous location, but a profound governance failure. An unmanaged border region becoming a haven for disaffected subjects, the hyenas, who eventually become instruments of the kingdom's downfall. Border regions left ungoverned inevitably become sources of instability. This leads to a critical realization. Mufasa's mishandling of Scar represents a larger pattern of governance through strength rather than systems. His approach relied on personal authority rather than institutional frameworks, creating a kingdom that could not survive its founder. What's particularly telling is how little preparation Simba received for addressing these political realities. Mufasa's lessons focus on philosophical concepts rather than practical governance challenges. The famous "everything the light touches" scene demonstrates this problem perfectly. Simba learns about territorial boundaries, but nothing about managing the complex political tensions those boundaries create. Looking at canonical evidence, we can identify a clear pattern in Mufasa's leadership approach. Impressive personal strength combined with alarming institutional weakness. This contradiction explains how a seemingly thriving kingdom could collapse so rapidly following a single transition of power. This changes everything. What if the Pride Lands were never as stable as they appeared, but were instead a political powder keg waiting for a spark? When we compare Mufasa's governance approach with successful long-term political systems, the deficiencies become obvious. Sustainable kingdoms historically incorporated mechanisms for peaceful succession, meaningful roles for royal family members, and integration of diverse stakeholders into governance. The Pride Lands under Mufasa lacked all these elements. This context makes Mufasa's approach to Scar all the more inexplicable. As both brother and potential successor, Scar should have either been given meaningful responsibilities within the kingdom or formally removed from succession possibilities. Instead, he occupied a dangerous political limbo, close enough to power to covet it, but excluded enough to resent it. What makes this failure even more striking is that Mufasa was clearly aware of Scar's ambitions. Their interactions show not just family tension, but political wariness. Yet, despite recognizing the threat, Mufasa implemented no systemic protections to prevent the very coup that eventually occurred. Come on, these aren't the actions of a politically astute ruler. They're the decisions of a king who fundamentally misunderstood the nature of governance stability. Personal strength, no matter how impressive, cannot compensate for structural vulnerabilities in a kingdom's political framework. A ruler's legacy isn't measured in their lifetime, but in what remains after they're gone. Further evidence of this systemic weakness appears in the Pride's response to Mufasa's demise. The lions demonstrate no coordinated resistance to Scar's seizure of power. There are no established protocols, no council of Pride elders, no mechanism to protect the legitimate heir. This institutional vacuum allowed Scar to claim authority with alarming ease. When we compare this transition with Simba's eventual return, the difference becomes clear. Simba's challenge to Scar succeeds not just through personal combat, but through rebuilding fractured alliances and political legitimacy. These crucial political skills weren't learned from Mufasa's example. They were developed despite it. This brings us to perhaps the most troubling aspect of Mufasa's dynastic negligence: his failure to establish clear succession protocols beyond primogeniture. Relying solely on bloodline inheritance without institutional safeguards created a system where a single successful coup could completely upend kingdom governance. All of these governance failures became devastatingly apparent the moment Mufasa was no longer there to hold the system together through sheer force of personality. The Pride Land's rapid descent into ecological disaster wasn't simply the result of Scar's poor leadership. It was the inevitable consequence of institutional weaknesses Mufasa failed to address. But Mufasa's failures extended beyond his mishandling of internal political threats. His second fatal mistake, resource mismanagement, created unsustainable pressures that would eventually contribute to ecological collapse. The true extent of this catastrophic governance error becomes clear when we examine how Mufasa's approach to the hyena territories created the perfect conditions for environmental disaster. Mufasa's second fatal mistake, resource mismanagement, reveals perhaps his most profound governance failure. The canonical evidence demonstrates a troubling pattern. Mufasa created artificial resource scarcity through territorial exclusion that would ultimately prove catastrophic for the Pride Lands ecosystem. Let's analyze what the source material actually shows us. The hyenas were confined to the elephant graveyard, a barren, resource-depleted region bordering the Pride Lands. This territorial policy created an unsustainable pressure cooker. A large population of predators contained in an area with insufficient resources to support them. Excluding entire populations from resource access doesn't eliminate the problem, it amplifies it. This policy contradiction is striking when contrasted with Mufasa's own circle of life philosophy. If all creatures have their place in the natural balance, what was the ecological role assigned to hyenas? Canon shows no attempt to integrate them into sustainable resource management, only forcible exclusion that guaranteed eventual conflict. From a governance perspective, this represents a critical failure of inclusive resource management. Sustainable political systems throughout history have recognized that excluded populations don't simply disappear. They become sources of instability that eventually threaten the entire system. The evidence appears throughout canonical scenes. When Mufasa confronts the hyenas in the elephant graveyard, he demonstrates impressive personal strength, but implements no policy solutions to address the underlying resource conflict. This pattern, addressing symptoms through force rather than causes through policy, defined Mufasa's approach to governance. What if Mufasa had instead implemented a managed integration of hyenas into the Pride Lands ecosystem? Historical examples of sustainable predator-prey relationships suggest this was possible. Instead, his exclusionary policy created perfect conditions for the very alliance between Scar and the hyenas that would ultimately devastate his kingdom. This changes everything. The ecological collapse of the Pride Lands wasn't simply Scar's doing, it was the inevitable result of resource tensions Mufasa failed to resolve. Let's be methodical in analyzing how this resource mismanagement directly contributed to the kingdom's downfall. The hyenas' eventual overconsumption of Pride Lands resources wasn't a surprise. It was the predictable outcome of populations suddenly released from artificial constraints without sustainable management frameworks. Honestly, the evidence is hiding in plain sight. When Scar invites the hyenas into the Pride Lands, they don't create a new problem. They simply make visible the unsustainable tensions that had been building under Mufasa's territorial policies. The rapid resource depletion that follows reveals how fragile the ecological balance truly was. This brings us to Mufasa's third fatal mistake: err unprepared. His failure to equip Simba with practical governance skills. Canon provides overwhelming evidence of this critical oversight. Mufasa's lessons to Simba focus on philosophical concepts and personal values rather than practical leadership challenges. A kingdom's future depends not just on the character of its heir, but on their practical preparation for governance. The famous "everything the light touches" scene exemplifies this problem. Simba learns about the kingdom's territorial extent, but receives no practical instruction on how to manage its complex ecological and political dynamics. He's taught to admire the kingdom without understanding how to govern it. Even more tellingly, Mufasa's explanation of the shadowy place, the elephant graveyard, offers no insight into managing relations with the hyenas, only a simplistic prohibition against going there. This represents a critical governance failure, teaching avoidance rather than engagement with the kingdom's most pressing challenge. What makes this particularly damaging is that it continues a pattern across generations. Just as Mufasa failed to resolve the hyena situation, he failed to prepare Simba to address it, creating conditions for the same problems to persist and intensify. The consequences become clear when Simba eventually returns to reclaim the throne. His challenges extend far beyond defeating Scar. He must rebuild an ecological system and governance structure for which he received no practical preparation. The skills that ultimately make Simba successful as a ruler were not learned from Mufasa's teachings. A ruler who teaches only values without methods leaves their heir vulnerable to precisely the challenges they'll face. Let's examine specific canonical evidence of this preparation failure. When Simba expresses curiosity about the elephant graveyard, Mufasa responds with prohibition rather than explanation. When Simba questions his future responsibilities, Mufasa offers romantic visions of stars rather than practical governance frameworks. This pattern created a dangerous knowledge gap. Simba inherited his father's title without inheriting the practical skills needed to address the kingdom's challenges. The result was predictable. Upon his return, Simba initially struggles with the complex realities of rebuilding a collapsed ecosystem and fractured society. The cumulative impact of these three fatal mistakes, dynastic negligence, resource mismanagement, and heir unprepared, created perfect conditions for the Pride Land's collapse. Each failure amplified the others, creating systemic vulnerabilities that guaranteed crisis once Mufasa was no longer present to hold the system together through personal authority. What's particularly revealing is how these mistakes contradicted Mufasa's own stated principles. His circle of life philosophy emphasized interconnection and balance, yet his governance approach created division and instability. This contradiction between values and actions undermined the kingdom's resilience. Governance systems that contradict their own stated values inevitably create the conditions for crisis. Let's be precise in tracing how these three failures combined to ensure the kingdom's collapse. Mufasa's mishandling of Scar created an internal political threat with both motive and opportunity to seize power. His exclusionary approach to the hyenas created a disenfranchised population eager to support any alternative to the existing regime. His failure to prepare Simba for practical governance ensured that even if his heir survived, he would struggle to address these accumulated challenges. Together, these governance failures transformed what should have been a stable transition of power into a catastrophic regime change with devastating ecological consequences. What makes this analysis particularly compelling is how it transforms our understanding of the entire narrative. The Pride Land's devastation wasn't simply bad luck or one villain's malice. It was the predictable outcome of structural vulnerabilities created by Mufasa's leadership failures. This perspective doesn't diminish Mufasa as a character. His personal virtues remain admirable, but it does require us to reassess his legacy as a ruler. The evidence suggests he was a king whose impressive personal qualities masked profound governance deficiencies that ultimately doomed his kingdom. The implications extend beyond Mufasa himself to challenge our understanding of leadership. Personal strength and good intentions, while valuable, cannot compensate for structural governance failures. A truly successful ruler builds systems that outlast them, something Mufasa fundamentally failed to do. As we connect these governance failures to the specific consequences that followed Mufasa's absence, a disturbing pattern emerges. Scar's ability to seize power wasn't simply the result of his own cunning. It was enabled by specific vulnerabilities in the political system Mufasa created. But the full implications of these governance failures become even clearer when we examine how they directly enabled Scar's rise to power and the subsequent collapse of the Pride Land's ecosystem. The direct connection between Mufasa's governance failures and Scar's ability to seize power reveals the true extent of the Golden King's political miscalculations. This wasn't simply a case of villainous opportunism. It was the predictable exploitation of systemic vulnerabilities Mufasa himself created. Let's trace this connection precisely. Scar's coup succeeded through three specific advantages: his proximity to power as the king's brother, his alliance with the excluded hyena population, and the absence of institutional protections for the legitimate heir. Each advantage derived directly from one of Mufasa's fatal governance mistakes. Political systems collapse not when attacked from without, but when vulnerable from within. Mufasa's dynastic negligence gave Scar both motive and opportunity. By keeping his brother in a position of privilege without purpose, Mufasa created the perfect conditions for resentment while maintaining Scar's access to court politics. This toxic combination, high status with low responsibility, historically produces precisely the kind of destabilizing internal threat Scar became. What makes this failure so striking is that canon shows Mufasa was aware of the danger. His confrontations with Scar demonstrate clear recognition of his brother's ambitions. Yet, despite this awareness, he implemented no systemic protections against the very power grab that eventually occurred. Mufasa's resource mismanagement created Scar's most crucial alliance. By implementing exclusionary policies toward the hyenas rather than managed integration, Mufasa guaranteed they would support any alternative to his regime. This created a ready-made coalition Scar could mobilize against the established order. marginalized populations don't disappear. They become powerful allies for regime challengers. The evidence appears in how quickly and easily Scar formed his alliance with the hyenas. This wasn't opportunistic. It was the inevitable political consequence of Mufasa's territorial policies. The hyena's eagerness to support Scar reveals the depth of resentment Mufasa's exclusionary approach had created. Finally, Mufasa's failure to prepare Simba for practical governance left his heir vulnerable at the moment of greatest crisis. Without practical political skills or knowledge of court dynamics, Simba had no framework for recognizing or countering Scar's manipulation. This preparation gap proved nearly fatal for both heir and kingdom. When we compare this with other Disney monarchies, Mufasa's governance failures become even more apparent. Consider how Corona Entangled maintains institutional continuity during their ruler's absence, or how Arendelle in Frozen demonstrates clear succession protocols despite royal crisis. These systems display the resilience Mufasa's Pride Lands critically lacked. This changes everything. What if Simba's exile wasn't merely a personal tragedy, but the inevitable result of a political system with no safeguards? Let's apply real political theory to understand these failures more precisely. Mufasa's governance model resembles what political scientists call a personalist regime, a system where authority centers on an individual ruler rather than institutions. Such systems typically collapse rapidly following the leader's departure, precisely as the Pride Lands did. The parallels with historical African leadership transitions are particularly revealing. Pre-colonial African kingdoms that survived succession crises typically featured councils of elders, defined roles for royal family members, and integration mechanisms for potentially hostile neighbors. All elements conspicuously absent from Mufasa's governance approach. What's especially disturbing about these failures is that they weren't inevitable. Canon provides glimpses of alternatives Mufasa could have pursued. Meaningful roles for Scar that channeled his ambition constructively, managed resource sharing with the hyenas, and practical governance education for Simba. Each missed opportunity represents a critical leadership failure. Come on, the evidence is overwhelming. The Pride Lands' devastation wasn't simply Scar's malice, it was the predictable outcome of governance vulnerabilities Mufasa failed to address. The speed and completeness of the kingdom's collapse reveals how fragile its political foundations truly were. A kingdom dependent on one ruler's strength cannot survive their absence. This perspective transforms how we view the Pride Lands' recovery under Simba. His success wasn't simply a restoration of Mufasa's approach, but its fundamental transformation. Where Mufasa ruled through personal authority, Simba eventually built alliances. Where Mufasa excluded the hyenas, Simba ultimately integrated former enemies into a more inclusive society. The strongest evidence of Mufasa's governance failures appears not in the Pride Lands' collapse, but in how differently Simba had to rule to restore stability. The political lessons that saved the kingdom weren't learned from Mufasa's example. They required Simba to transcend his father's governance model. Let's be clear, this analysis doesn't diminish Mufasa as a character or father figure. His personal virtues, courage, dignity, compassion, remain admirable, but lionizing his leadership while ignoring his governance failures prevents us from understanding the true political lessons of the Pride Lands saga. What if Mufasa's true legacy isn't as the ideal king, but as a ruler whose political blind spots ensured his kingdom's downfall? This perspective doesn't make him a villain. It makes him a tragically flawed leader whose personal strengths masked critical governance weaknesses. The most compelling evidence for this interpretation appears in how the Pride Lands evolve across generations. The governance approach that ultimately stabilizes the kingdom under Simba and Kiara bears little resemblance to Mufasa's model. Instead, it incorporates precisely the elements Mufasa's leadership lacked: inclusion of former enemies, distributed authority, and systemic resilience. A truly successful ruler builds systems that transcend their own limitations. This evolution reveals perhaps the most important lesson of the Pride Lands saga. Leadership success isn't measured by personal authority, but by institutional legacy. By this standard, Mufasa's rule must be judged not simply by the prosperity during his lifetime, but by the collapse that followed his absence. The parallels with real-world governance transitions are striking. Throughout history, charismatic leaders who fail to build resilient institutions have seen their legacies erased soon after their departure. Mufasa's failure to create governance structures that could survive without him places him squarely in this category. What makes this assessment particularly challenging is how it contradicts the narrative's surface presentation of Mufasa. He's portrayed as wise and admirable, qualities he genuinely possesses as a character. But wisdom in personal matters doesn't automatically translate to political acumen, as his governance failures clearly demonstrate. The full implications of these failures become clear when we consider how differently events might have unfolded with better governance. A meaningful role for Scar could have channeled his ambition constructively. Managed integration of the hyenas could have prevented their alliance with Scar. Practical political education for Simba could have prepared him to recognize and counter Scar's manipulation. Instead, Mufasa's governance approach created perfect conditions for the very crisis that devastated his kingdom. This wasn't fate or misfortune. It was the predictable consequence of specific leadership failures that left the Pride Lands vulnerable to precisely the threats it eventually faced. But the story doesn't end with critique. The Pride Lands' eventual recovery under Simba and Kiara offers crucial insights into how these governance failures were ultimately corrected, and what this tells us about Mufasa's true legacy. The true measure of Mufasa's governance failures appears in how, fundamentally, Simba had to transform the Pride Lands' political structure to achieve lasting stability. This wasn't simply restoration. It was systematic reform addressing precisely the vulnerabilities his father had created. Tracing this evolution reveals the full scope of Mufasa's political miscalculations. Where Mufasa ruled through personal authority, Simba eventually builds a coalition including former enemies. Where Mufasa excluded the hyenas, Simba ultimately creates a more inclusive society. Where Mufasa left Scar's ambitions unaddressed, Simba actively works to integrate Kovu into a constructive role. True leadership isn't measured by authority maintained, but by legacy sustained. The canonical evidence for this transformation appears throughout Simba's arc. His initial approach, attempting to rule as his father had, proves inadequate for addressing the kingdom's challenges. Only by transcending Mufasa's governance model and implementing the very reforms his father neglected does Simba achieve lasting stability. This evolutionary pattern continues into the next generation. Kiara and Kovu's union represents the final correction of Mufasa's original mistakes. The integration of former enemies into a shared governance structure that prevents the very power struggles Mufasa failed to resolve. This changes everything. What if the Pride Land's ultimate salvation came not from following Mufasa's example, but from transcending it? Let's be precise in identifying the specific reforms that corrected Mufasa's governance failures. First, Simba addresses dynastic negligence by actively integrating Kovu, precisely the kind of potentially destabilizing royal figure Mufasa failed to accommodate with Scar. Rather than allowing resentment to build, Simba eventually creates a constructive role for his daughter's mate. Second, Simba corrects resource mismanagement by implementing a more inclusive approach to former outsiders. Where Mufasa created artificial scarcity through exclusion, Simba eventually establishes sustainable resource sharing that prevents future conflict. Third, Simba ensures Kiara receives practical political education, evident in her ability to negotiate peace between warring factions, a skill Simba himself never learned from Mufasa. This breaks the cycle of unprepared heirs that left the kingdom vulnerable. What's particularly revealing is how difficult these reforms proved for Simba initially. His resistance to changing his father's governance model nearly leads to the same conflicts repeating. Only by recognizing the limitations of Mufasa's approach does Simba finally establish lasting stability. A leader truly honors their predecessor, not by replicating their mistakes, but by transcending their limitations. This perspective transforms our understanding of Mufasa's legacy. His greatest contribution to the Pride Lands may not have been his own rule, but the lessons his failures provided for future generations. Through Simba and Kiara, the kingdom eventually develops precisely the governance approaches Mufasa neglected. The evidence appears in how the Pride Lands ecosystem recovers under this reformed governance model. The restoration isn't simply a return to previous conditions, but the establishment of a more resilient system built on inclusion rather than exclusion, cooperation rather than domination. What makes this assessment challenging is how it contradicts cultural lionization of Mufasa. He remains an impressive and virtuous character, but his personal qualities mask governance deficiencies that nearly doomed his kingdom. Recognizing these failures doesn't diminish him as a character, but allows us to understand the narrative's true political insights. Let's face it, We've been so captivated by Mufasa's charisma and Scar's villainy that we've missed the structural governance lessons at the heart of the Pride Lands saga. The kingdom's collapse and recovery revealed truths about leadership that transcend individual personalities. The final assessment of Mufasa's leadership must acknowledge this complexity. He was a king of impressive personal qualities, whose governance approach nevertheless contained fatal flaws. His legacy isn't simply the prosperity during his lifetime, but the institutional vulnerabilities that nearly destroyed everything he built. The true test of leadership isn't immediate prosperity, but sustainable legacy. This perspective offers a more nuanced understanding of Mufasa than either uncritical admiration or harsh condemnation. He was neither perfect ruler nor failed king, but something more complex, a leader whose strengths and weaknesses shaped generations of Pride Lands governance. The most important insight this analysis provides is how leadership evolves across generations. Mufasa's governance model, while impressive in the moment, proved unsustainable. Simba's approach, though initially uncertain, eventually created the stability his father's reign lacked. Kiara and Kovu's partnership suggests a further evolution toward more inclusive governance. This progression reveals perhaps the most important political lesson of the Pride Lands saga. No single leadership model endures forever. Sustainable governance requires constant evolution, addressing the specific challenges each generation faces. Mufasa's failure to recognize this necessity created vulnerabilities his successors eventually had to correct. What's particularly powerful about this interpretation is how it transforms the entire narrative from simple hero's journey to complex political evolution. The Pride Lands' story becomes not just personal drama, but a chronicle of governance learning from generation to generation. The provocative question that emerges is whether Mufasa should still be considered the ideal king, given these governance failures. The evidence suggests a more complicated assessment. A ruler of genuine virtues whose political blind spots nevertheless created the conditions for disaster. Perhaps the true wisdom lies in recognizing that no leader, however impressive, provides a perfect governance model. The Pride Lands' ultimate salvation came not from idealizing Mufasa, but from learning from his mistakes. A lesson about leadership that transcends the narrative itself. As we reflect on Mufasa's complex legacy, we might ask ourselves, which aspects of his leadership deserve admiration, and which require critical reassessment? The answer isn't simple lionization or condemnation, but a nuanced understanding of how even the most charismatic rulers can create the conditions for their legacy's undoing. The Pride Lands saga ultimately teaches us that true leadership success isn't measured in moments of glory, but in systems that endure. By this standard, Mufasa's rule represents not an ideal to be emulated, but a complicated legacy whose failures provided crucial lessons for the leaders who followed. The majestic figure standing on Pride Rock, commanding respect and admiration, also created the vulnerability that nearly destroyed everything he built. This contradiction doesn't diminish Mufasa as a character. It makes him a more complex and human figure whose story offers deeper insights into the true nature of governance and legacy.